Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Life from the Inside Out with Kris. Before we begin with Kris's unparalleled metaphysical content, I know that many of you watching have felt a sense of being ungrounded, unhinged, or out of balance in these times. I know, I've felt this way too. Kris's teachings have similarities to popular ideas such as the law of attraction and the secret. The difference is that Kris's knowledge goes even deeper into reality creation and helps resolve many of the problems identified with the law of attraction. The information he shares helps restore grounding and that sense of balance that many of us have lost in these times. If you're ready for the law of attraction and secret 2.0 and want to be a part of this fantastic community, then hit that like button, subscribe, drop a comment below, and press the bell icon so that you get notified when Kris releases cool, new metaphysical content. Kris also offers life-changing online seminars, private sessions, and mentoring sessions, which are all linked in the description below. Glad you're here with us, and let's jump into it. Welcome back to another episode of Life from the Inside Out with Kris. And I know last episode we talked a little bit about, overcoming authoritarian thoughts and some of the origins of that and what we can do to move towards collaboration, cooperation, and a sense of connection. So Kris is here with us already, and we'll build on that.
Indeed. And once again, we trust that you are comfortable and thank you for your consideration.
Thank you as well, Kris. Welcome back.
Now, a few moments before, you spoke about congruency.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some views concerning being congruent or congruency sometimes imply that everything must be perfectly aligned 100%.
Mm-hmm.
And that may be very difficult, especially when you consider that there are times when you need to make certain kinds of healthy compromises. So the congruency might not necessarily be 100%. But the idea is that you have a certain degree of flexibility towards congruency so that you can make things work more easily for yourself. It does not mean that you must then accept defeat, whether it is from yourself or anywhere else. But the idea is that you are expressing a willingness to be flexible, to consider other points of view, to be able to empathize, maybe even walk in someone's shoes for a few moments to get to understand another individual's point of view, where they are coming from, without necessarily compromising your own. There are always very nice methods and ways to make those little concessions so that everyone actually has a good time with life. That way you can cease beating yourself up for one thing or another, or feeling as if you might have failed. Because in life there truly are no failures, nor are there any mistakes in that sense, but there are opportunities to understand how your thoughts that come from your particular feelings, that may come from your particular beliefs, can all be tweaked or edited in such a way that the outcome is favorable not only to yourself, but for those others who may be involved in whatever situation or condition is being worked through, and primarily with yourself. Individuals have many kinds of thoughts simultaneously. One person may entertain hundreds and thousands of thoughts, not just throughout the day, of course, but definitely a very large amount of thoughts on a daily basis. Some go in and some go out. Some are perhaps captured. Oh, this might be interesting. This might be interesting. And so on and so forth. But the idea is that they are just that. They are thoughts. They come complete with different narratives or stories that you then utilize to convince yourself of a situation or another. And interestingly, stories are actually vital to human growth, understanding, and even survival. Throughout human history, as we suggested in the previous discussion, consciousness experiencing itself as human, as well as everything else in your universe, including the universe itself, is a story in itself. Being human is a story. And what you do as a human being is a complete set of stories. And humans have communicated from one to another, from one society to another, from one culture to another, from one nation and one civilization to another, through stories. Stories have been the foundation of what you have as the human experience. So stories are extraordinarily necessary. That is why, in many respects, in we will just call the olden days, when one nation declared war on another and conquered it, the conquering nation would impose its story on the conquered and try to erase the conquered's own story. And this cycle is repeated even today in one form or another. Stories carry the essential seeds of your experiences. And as such, even you tell yourself different stories on a daily basis, and these stories become your life and your conditions. And this implies something utterly fascinating. If they are stories, then you can also tell yourself a different kind of story than the one that has been utilized for some time, that suddenly you recognize something is off, something is no longer congruent, something doesn't work anymore in my life. So you can recognize the kind of story that you have been repeating and repeatedly telling yourself. You can edit it. You can do something else and you can create a new story. Even if the new story seems to conflict with the old story, eventually begin to draw away from, reduce the attention you give to the old story and increase the attention you give to the new story. Eventually, the new story begins to take root. You begin to believe it. You begin to live it. It becomes your deeds. These deeds or actions become your life. So everything is based on the premise of storytelling in one form or another. Even at its very basic, the beliefs that you hold as an individual, the beliefs that are held by the human race, are just that. They are stories. They are ideas that have been accepted as a truth. Thus, if an idea or a story begins to demonstrate too many incongruencies or holes and cracks, it no longer makes sense to try and patch it up, because it simply means you are trying to still utilize the old, even though it can no longer function as it used to. So you can begin by looking for new ideas. And what we presented in the last discussion, the notion that you are holy and sacred, and as we suggested in the past, that your actually basic worldview, the one that is inherent within you, is about love, creativity, and collaboration. So these 5 things, love, creativity, collaboration, that you're holy and sacred, can literally transform you in a very short amount of time. It is understood that you will have your inner battles along this one because you're accustomed to the old story. But now you want a new story based upon these things. You can become excited about it. You can actually even see and feel and imagine what the outcome of that kind of a worldview can produce in your life. And there is no escaping it. Regardless of what story, what kind of narrative you tell yourself, it will be so. So you have to choose what kind of story, what kind of narrative becomes your life.
And Kris, are there mechanisms or different things that might give us a clue when we're getting ready to write a new story? Things either in our body or our psyche that could say, like, hey, we're kind of ready to move on to a new story. Are there things that come up, and what might some of
There
those
may
be?
indeed be many kinds of red flags,
Oh.
some alerts. Just like nowadays on your iPhones or other mobile devices, you get amber alerts, you get weather alerts, extreme weather alerts, and so many things. So you actually can notice when something seems to no longer function in your life. Perhaps you are recognizing that you are more and more dissatisfied, even exasperated by your 9 to 5.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps your home situation is no longer fulfilling you. Perhaps your relationship is no longer bringing you the joy it used to. Perhaps even your financial situation or other situations seem to be crumbling. Perhaps you find yourself uncertain about your future. Perhaps you notice that you are no longer feeling grounded in your life, as if something may need to be jettisoned. There are perhaps emotional, psychological, and other situations that now feel like a burden. And some of these burdens may have been carried for decades, where you thought if you do not pay any mind to them, they simply disappear. But they do not. They take root. And when those roots and those trees become big enough, now you have to do something about it. And sometimes it has come into the state of there is a dire need for you to pay attention to those things. You could have paid attention to them 5, 10, 15 years ago, but you choose not to. Perhaps because you thought you might have been disempowered, not valuable enough. You did not have the right sense of worth. Now you feel as if somehow or other you are up against a brick wall at the edge of a cliff. And it could be emotional, psychological, otherwise. So when you recognize that you are now fighting your own best interests and even sabotaging yourself, we would say it is high time to look at the kinds of stories that you have been running around in your head, that you have been telling and even trying to convince yourself that this should still work for you, even though it no longer does.
Well,
So
there's
you
a
might have darned the socks so many times there is no thread left to darn with. It's time for a new pair of socks, so to speak. So you understand the metaphor.
Yeah, we begin to notice those things. And you said something that seemed really key for me is that when we're it's not that we can pretend that the story doesn't exist. That doesn't work. We have to consciously rewrite the story, is what I'm hearing from you.
Indeed. If you have to try to patch it repeatedly, and you are aware of doing so, especially, it might be high time to put the brakes on and take stock, take inventory of those old stories, of those old thoughts, of those old ideas. And they may indeed be decades old that simply need to be jettisoned, that need to be put to the curb. And individuals go through this all the time. It is part of the human experience. And one does not necessarily bring this upon oneself. This is not the idea to blame. But when there is the recognition of such, this actually is a fortuitous occasion. It actually can be time for a celebration. You're recognizing that you are now at the crossroads. Once you cross that road, you go from disempowered towards empowered, which sometimes can be frightening. It could even be unsettling at first because you are not accustomed to this kind of energy, this kind of input in your own life, something that you can design for yourself instead of wearing mentally and emotionally the designs others have given you to wear. So when you recognize that you have outgrown your wardrobe, for instance, your clothing are torn or tattered, or perhaps somehow or other mysteriously they have all shrunk in the dryer, no longer fitting you, you go buy new sets of clothes, correct?
Yes, that's what I'm quite fond of.
Indeed. So these things, psychologically and emotionally, are also just as important and significant. So you acquire, you look at different and new stories, but this time, stories that grow your being, as we suggested earlier, that fan that tiny little spark and bring it to a full flame so that you can shine bright, so that you can enjoy your true nature.
Yeah, and I hear you, Kris. One of the things I noticed as I began working on and making that shift within myself, I remember a couple times, especially in the last year or two, of being like, "Where's all the drama? Where's all the conflict? Where's it? Where's it at?" And even my mind just being quiet, and within that quietness, having to catch myself and be like, "Oh, okay, well, this is a point where I could be making a decision and not just acting on some sort of autopilot or auto program." So those are some things that folks might begin to notice too.
Absolutely. And as you pointed out, many simply run on autopilot, but that is part of the problem. There is not an actual mindfulness applied to exactly what one is thinking and doing as a result of the thinking. So many people basically shoot from the hip first, then ask questions. There's one entirely valid way of creating one's reality since you do it, but when it begins to be an impediment to your own well being, it is time now to hold back and revise, to become mindful, to examine the contents of your own mind, to inventorize the thoughts, the ideas, the stories, all those narratives, and to recognize, yes, there might indeed be stories that no longer work for me. So again, the idea is to reduce the attention to the old story, start creating new stories, and shift your attention to that. shift your energy to that. The old stories will no longer have any influence. You do not have to slash and burn. They will wither away on their own from your attention. But what you do need is to pay attention to the things that you want in your life as those narratives or stories for your own well-being at any and every level.
Well,
So you can look at certain situations people draw to themselves. Perhaps there is poverty in their lives, and they will bemoan that to a great degree. And they may even keep repeating to themselves that they are impoverished or they are poor. Look at their situation, which seems to reinforce the idea. Now, we're not saying that you will click your heels 3 times and then magically be transported into a world of riches, but you can begin slowly to change the story. And that is actually far more effective than wishful thinking that somehow or other everything will magically be transformed to begin with. The idea that one can be far richer internally in their inner lives than anything they have ever conceived of is quite viable. One has to begin somewhere. This has nothing to do with trying to blame the person that is impoverished or the victim or anything of that manner. This is simply to have a point of departure. You must have some jumping off point into a new story. That is to recognize your environment, recognize your life as it stands. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you will be happy if you, and only if you become ultra rich. But you must recognize that the old no longer works. So start moving away from it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And there was a quote coming to mind that really helped me to understand this. This was from, I learned it from Wayne Dyer, but I believe it was somebody else. He said, you don't learn to float by contemplating the sinking of things.
That is absolutely correct. In fact, that would create the very opposite effect. Now, do you have any last observation or inquiry?
Well, no, I think for this episode, that was kind of my final thought. Was that little imagery there?
Indeed. So our final utterance, if you like, is when you notice something no longer works or brings you, oh dear, we're going to use a cliche now, when it no longer brings you joy, start focusing your attention on things that do bring you joy. Even if it is tiny, the tiniest spark can be fanned into a flame. And that is the important point. You must start somewhere. Stop feeling helpless. Start feeling that you can have a significant say in how your life is going to turn out. And with that, we thank you for your consideration.
Oh, thanks so much, Kris.